Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. For well over a year now, we have heard the question from people outside the Liberal Party, from people inside the Liberal Party, wondering why the Prime Minister is choosing to stay when his party, under his leadership, is doing so badly in the polls. So bad, in fact, that come the next election, if numbers hold, Liberals could find themselves going from government to third-party status in the House. Still, the Prime Minister says he is determined to fight the next election, saying it most recently in an interview with one of his MPs.
Whatever this next election is going to be about, I think the pattern of crises that we've hit, whether they've been economic or military or geopolitical or health, have not been something that was on the ballot or even discussed in the debate.
Yeah.
And that idea of knowing someone's values, knowing the frame with which they approach challenges, is not just important, it's ultimately sort of the only thing.
And that interview was with Toronto Liberal MP Nate Erskine-Smith, who has his own podcast. It is called Uncommons. And to talk about what we just heard, we're now joined by our strategist. Susan Smith is principal with Blue Sky Strategy Group, Cole Hogan, principal with GT and Company, and Nasha Brownridge, senior consultant with Strategy Core. Hello to the three of you.
Hello. Michael. Hi, Michael.
So, it was interesting because, people, for months now, people have been wondering, why is the Prime Minister staying in the fight, even if his poll numbers are bad? And when you listen to that interview, again, with Erskine-Smith, he talks about having the drive, he talks about being able and knowing how to fight Conservatives. But it also seems a large part of it has to do with preserving legacy, because he talked a lot about what he's already accomplished. He didn't really outline what he's hoping to achieve if he is elected again in government. What do you make of what we heard from the Prime Minister?
I don't think I would call it legacy. I think when you've been a Prime Minister for a certain amount of time, you have to be prepared to defend what it is you've put in place. And I think that Prime Minister Trudeau sees it as a differentiator between himself and Mr. Poilievre. Like Mr. Poilievre, they haven't put all the new things in the window. Some of the things that they're going to be fighting on, dental care, school lunch program, the Canada Child Benefit, those programs for families he's talking about. I don't know so much that it's a legacy, but he does want people to be thinking about the question, you know what we stand for, what Liberals stand for, this Prime Minister speaking, what does that guy stand for? And, the narrative so far from Poilievre is Canada is broken, but not what he's going to do to fix it. And so I think that's the juxtaposition the Prime Minister is seeking for. And that clip that you just aired was, in times of crisis, you know how we have stood up for Canadians. Can this guy handle it, and what would he do, and do you trust him to do the right thing?
Cool.
Yeah, I think the job of Prime Minister, I've heard, is one that you not readily give away. It's one that's taken from you. And I think in this interview, I saw a lot of the Prime Minister not really having something to campaign on in the next election. And, beyond self-serving and legacy reasons, there's nothing on offer there that's particularly compelling. It's more, in my opinion, a save the furniture kind of mode. The Liberal Party also, it doesn't have the same drive and momentum that it had in 2015, and people don't want to vote for it anymore.
Okay, Nasha, what do you think?
I think it's a bold move to run on a legacy when currently you're down in the polls and Canadians aren't buying what you've done. So while I do agree that the Prime Minister, in this actual interview or podcast, he seemed comfortable. He seemed at home. He is being interviewed by a former MP from his party.
Current MP still.
Currently, my apologies, current. A current member of Parliament, but at the same time, he sounds arguably arrogant given where his party currently sits with Canadians. They are not doing well in the polls, which I'm sure we'll get to later. But to run on a record that is not resonating with Canadians is super intriguing to me. And I think it's an interesting strategic move.
Okay, let me pick up on the point you're making, Nasha, but also the point you made, Susan, because, the Prime Minister does make this argument, and we heard a bit of it, that Canadians know him. They know where his values lie. And in a moment of crisis, there's a certain predictability about that. He makes the argument you don't know that about Pierre Poilievre, despite the fact that Poilievre has been a politician for 20 years. But, when you hear what Nasha is saying, Susan, is that enough? This idea that you know who I am, is that enough to convince Canadians that when it's time to vote, that you should still put your vote with the Liberals despite what the polling numbers say?
Well, I think they have to. We're not in a campaign yet, Michael.
Really?
And people. Well, okay. I think there's powder being kept dry.
Okay.
So I think until the writ is dropped, or until we get very close to it, until we get close to a budget, if we get that far, which I think would be sort of a platform type budget, the Prime Minister, by very dint of it, they are the policies of his government, has to stand up and remind people that in COVID we got you vaccines. There's a dental care program now that people who need it can have. Pharmacare bills about to be passed. There's child family benefits. We stood the right place with Ukraine. You know how we operate as it aligns with Canadian values. So that's your jumping off point for me. That guy, he's been around for 20 years, and apart from taking a paycheck from the Canadian taxpayer, what do you know about him? So there's somewhere to start from, but then they've got to put more in the window. But I think the closer you get to an actual writ period is when you see the new stuff out.
Okay. I know you want to say something. You're looking very intently, Cole.
I do. Well, I think the difference between these two leaders is one that's tellable from both of these interviews. So we had Trudeau say with Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, okay, what Canadians know about me is that I care. I really care. Oh, geez, I care so much. And Poilievre had a recent interview that he did in the Walrus with Paul Wells, where he talked about compassion is about results, and it's not about getting up there, putting your hand over your heart, bursting into tears and saying how much you care more than the other guy. It's about the results that you actually deliver for Canadians. So the difference is one guy's going to tell you how much he cares so much, and the other guy's going to drive results.
I think Canadian families can point to the results with daycare, with the Canada Child Benefit, the people who have dental care. There are results that can be pointed to. It's not for me to point them out. It would be for the Prime Minister to point them out with Mr. Poilievre. But if Mr. Poilievre wants to go show me the results game, I think that's a great one for Trudeau to be able to do. And what Trudeau can say is, well, what are you going to do? What aren't you going to cancel?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But on what Susan's saying there as well, some of the examples of wins that the Liberal Party and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau are pointing to are things that came out of the Supply and Confidence Agreement. And those were things that the NDP were pushing. So while there may be other things that you've mentioned might be part of that Liberal legacy, there's also many that were a part of an agreement that has now been ripped up. On the Pierre Poilievre side of this, it's interesting that the Prime Minister, number one, is trying to use, again, that legacy that we just spoke about. Pierre Poilievre has his 4 pillars that he brings up time and time again, trying to point to the future, but isn't necessarily, in this particular case, attacking in the way that you would expect. And what I mean by that is his policy is not necessarily speaking to what the Liberals did. He is speaking to what he wants to do, not to defend him per se. But ultimately, I think what it comes down to when we're talking about this podcast is the Prime Minister seemed arrogant, speaking about a record that isn't resonating with voters. And we've seen the polls, and we know that to be true.
Okay, you use the word arrogant, but I do, which I'm not using, but I do wonder whether or not the Prime Minister is underestimating Pierre Poilievre, because when in that interview we heard the same argument that we've been hearing ever since the Liberal Party convention, more than a year ago spring here in Ottawa, where Liberals were saying once people know Pierre Poilievre, they're not going to cast a vote for Pierre Poilievre, and that is the only argument we've mainly heard from Liberals, the only argument really heard from the Prime Minister in this interview. And in the meantime, you look at polling numbers, and if they actually hold, the Conservatives could have the largest majority ever in the House of Commons.
So on the day Pierre Poilievre was elected, I was sitting with you at the table, I said the Liberals need to brand him immediately. They need to go after him. They need to say who he is and not allow him to define himself. They failed to do that. So they are counting on, and I don't know if they'll be able to turn it around. It's looking very difficult to do so. They've allowed Poilievre all the time in the world to brand himself and to say whatever else he wants. And there have been no seeds planted about what he's actually like. It's a squandered opportunity. In my opinion, it's going to come back and bite them. And I think the Prime Minister talked about in the podcast he said, maybe we should have, I don't know. But what his view was, do it closer to the election. But I think the runway's gotten really short. So,
well, and at the very least, they don't necessarily control the runway, right?
No, but the last thing I would say is, I don't know that people really like Mr. Poilievre. I just think at the moment, before they have to go to the ballot and really decide, they're thinking about what could they have that's different. And in the end, they'll decide, do I like Poilievre? Do I like Trudeau? Do I like the Conservatives? Do I like the Liberals? They'll make their call there. But I don't think the jury hasn't come in yet on whether Poilievre has a lot of people who really like them or people are just tired of Mr. Trudeau after 10 years.
Okay, Cole?
Yeah, I think that Trudeau is overestimating, underestimating his opponent and underestimating his lack of popularity. Conservatives are up 22 points in the polls. They're leading with men and women, every age demographic. They're up 22 points in BC, 37 points in Alberta, 32 points in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, 24 points in Ontario, and 15 points in Atlantic Canada. So outside Quebec, we're looking at supermajority territory here, so it looks like a bit of a blowout, and I think Trudeau, it doesn't really have a clear picture of how unpopular he really is.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll add to the number, because less the Conservative numbers, but when you look at the latest Abacus Data poll, if you actually take Quebec out, because it looks like the Bloc's going to, whenever this vote happens, the Bloc's going to have a good election if the numbers hold, but the NDP outside of Quebec, countrywide, is now number 2. They're in second place. Statistical tie in real terms with the Liberals, but symbolically in second place ahead of the governing party. What do you say to that, Nasha?
So with that new polling coming out and all the statistics that we just heard right there, I think it is clear that Canadians are seeing that there is more than 2 parties that can form government. So while, of course, we see the Conservatives, the polling is looking absolutely the best for them at this particular moment in time, the NDP is gaining and the Liberals are losing. They are starting to hemorrhage staff. They're hemorrhaging their own nominated candidates. It's not going very well for them. Whereas the NDP, we've seen 3 MPPs in Ontario, for example, seek the federal nomination because there is momentum for the party happening. And whether that means they have a chance to face off against Pierre Poilievre for that prime minister role, or whether they're looking at official opposition, I think they are showing that they are the ones to go up against in the upcoming election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think if I look at BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, these are all provinces in which it's a blue versus orange world. The Liberal brand is pretty much dead in all of those provinces. In Ontario and Quebec, the Liberal Party is in 3rd place. And I think Trudeau is sinking that ship even further in those provinces. So I think the main point is, if the Liberal Party didn't exist today, would you invent it?
Okay, final word, Susan.
I think the answer is yes. Because Canadians like the middle of the road, and they don't like to tilt too far left, they don't like to tilt too far right or even farther right. They like to hang out in the middle, and that's why the Liberal Party has been the brand that it has been all along. I think this Liberal Party has to shore up its brand, and they have to bring a compelling narrative to Canadians in the next election. But we know I've been around long enough to know the Canadian electoral process, or the cycle, right? It's kind of every 10 years. Just ask Stephen Harper.
Okay. I like hanging out with you guys, FYI, just for the record. Susan, Cole, Nasha, thank you.
Thank you, Michael.